really important issues that face the planet today. I say to our students when they arrive how privileged we are to be here, to be at Cambridge, to be doing degrees or to do research or doing something else which we're passionate about and which is changing our lives. But our mission should be not to just to change our own lives, but to seek to change everybody else and change the world for the better. And if we can't do something in Cambridge where we've got some of the brightest minds, and in a college like Wolston where half the nations in the UN are represented as part of our studentship, then there's no other place we can do it. And so we invented these interdisciplinary research hubs whose function is to be a convening place for people who are interested in research in areas which require interdisciplinary minds. We're never going to solve the problem of climate change just by having a few engineers make better batteries. Right? We absolutely need people who are experts in policy. We do need the battery people, so if anybody here makes batteries, please, I don't want to tell you, we need you. But we need people in education, in communication, in policy, in economics. We need people coming at this issue not just from this terrible sort of Trump-light country that we appear to have turned into today, but we need to approach this from global perspectives. And so I'm delighted tonight that the Global Health Hub and the Sustainability and Conservation Hub have come together to really ask a huge question about the role of sort of inequality in what we're going to see as the effects on climate change. I've already apologised to the committees, but I will apologise to everybody else. I'm really sad. I can only be here for half of this event because we've got another interdisciplinary event in the college about the art. I'm glad this is being recorded and that we will have this online so I can see the rest of it. Thank you to the panellists for coming. Thank you to the rest of you. And I'm looking forward to a really sort of exciting and actually mind-blowing evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Charlie. It's a real privilege to be speaking at Wolfson College today. We've got a really exciting discussion this evening. Is the climate emergency a failure of inclusion? And I think this discussion comes at a time when we're really at a fork in the road for climate action. Extreme weather is the new normal. We've seen an area the size of the UK flooding Pakistan recently. Europe has experienced its worst droughts in 500 years. And we've seen energy nationalism on the rise as Western economies scramble for energy supplies this winter. And so today I'd like to unpack one central question, which I think certainly rings true in these uncertain times. Are we heading towards climate catastrophe, or is this a catalytic moment for climate action? And so to start off, we must ask ourselves, where are we? And so to address this, we must understand the process of COPs, and forgive me for those who are already well versed in COPs. COP, standing for Conference of the Parties, take place every year and bring together 196 parties under the United Nations. It is the binding commitments made at COPs that are implemented at a regional and national level. And that framework, called the Paris Agreement, was agreed in 2015 and set out 3 goals. 1, to keep global warming well below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5 degrees. 2, to scale up climate finance for developing countries, and I'm sure that's a topic we'll get into in the discussion. But 3, to adapt and address the impacts of climate change, adaptation, which is also critically important. And a key point here is the purpose of COPs are to make progress against each of these goals, but each of them are not equal in nature and scale. And so to come on to the question of where are we? So on emissions, prior to the Paris Agreement, scientists told us the world was on course for 4 degrees of global warming by the end of this century. Post-Paris, it was 3 degrees. And after COP26 in Glasgow, which I was really privileged to work on, we were able to say with credibility that we had kept that goal of 1.5 degrees alive. Countries at the last minute, despite the attempts of India and China to kill the agreement, for want of a better word, they agreed to review and strengthen their national climate plans by the end of this year, and agreed ambitious action to accelerate decarbonisation this decade in 4 areas: coal, cars, cash and trees, a slogan Boris Johnson used a lot on the fringes of Glasgow. But on the 24th of February, as we all know, the geopolitical landscape somewhat changed. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has prompted a return to the so-called energy trilemma. And even if Europe did see this crisis coming, which is up for grabs as a question, energy security and affordability has replaced climate action as the front-of-mind issue for policymakers. But while climate action is somewhat stalled, the climate crisis is not going to go away. It is here to stay. And one key lesson I learned from being in the UK's team on COP26 is that climate change is ultimately a leader-level political issue. Political leaders need to be sufficiently invested in the process to deliver positive outcomes from society. To take one case in point, in the run-up to Glasgow, we were told Modi wasn't going to back net zero 2070. I found out about half an hour before on the plane he changed his mind because he understood it was politically unpalatable to do so. The tide is turning. But a year from Glasgow, and we're under a month to COP27 in Egypt, are we on track? I think to answer this, it's quite complex, and we'll come on to this in the discussion. It depends on several factors. Firstly, this will be a different COP to Glasgow. It will be an African COP. I think that's important, extremely important. Finance, trust, solidarity will be really paramount, and that is reflected in the priorities that will be advocated by the Egyptian presidency over the course of the conference. Making promises on the 100 billion of international climate finance for developing countries, and we're still not on track to do so. Setting out a clear roadmap on adaptation finance. So last year in Glasgow, developed countries promised to double it to around 40 billion a year by 2025. Some say that's a drop in the ocean. The UN say around 300 billion is needed annually by developing countries. So adaptation finance will be a really key issue. But thirdly, and I think this is the most important, loss and damage. This goes right to the heart of climate justice, that those who've contributed the least to the crisis, particularly those in the global south, should be compensated to bear the fact that they are bearing the largest brunt of climate impacts. And Africa is a real case in point, contributing 3% to global emissions, but home to the top 10 countries in the world most disproportionately affected by climate change. I think this will be a real politically contentious issue in the discussions in Egypt, but I think there will have to be some direction of travel to a funding mechanism. Another thing COP27 will also have to do is to persuade the world it is on track and is moving, the world is moving in the right direction to travel on emissions. I think that's quite a tall order. If we take a look at the data, global fossil fuel emissions have rebounded to pre-pandemic levels of 2019, after initially falling by 5.4% in 2020 due to widespread lockdowns. And since Glasgow, only 23 nations, including 6 of the G20, the most important, as they account for 80% of emissions, have actually increased their 2030 plans. So it's looking a bit bleak. But that's why the following COP, COP28, that will take place in UAE next year, is even more important. Because here, and apologies for the technicalities, but I think it's important to bring this out, nations will take part in what is called the next global stocktake, if you like, an audit, a checkpoint of current emissions, saying, are we on track and where do we need to go? Because a big flexibility of the Paris Agreement is something called the Paris ratchet, the ratchet mechanism. A crank of the handle, if you like, as Christiana Figueres likes to describe it. Egypt needs to do enough to maintain momentum from Glasgow so that we impose another big crank of the handle in UAE next year. So to look ahead, where are we going and where is our destination? Well, it's quite tricky. We've got 8 years and just over 2 months to decarbonise economies and bend the curve of global warming downwards. Just not looking particularly positive, I would say. But I recognise in these uncertain times, policymakers and politicians face a really difficult balancing act. Ease the short-term burden and pain on citizens and businesses, but at the same time articulating a sensible, hard-headed case for a pro-climate, pro-jobs agenda, and also alongside this, ensure they're scaling up the finance needed, particularly for the developing world, to secure a global just transition. Perhaps we'll get onto that in the discussion. But I'm an optimist, for better or worse. I think there are some reasons to be cheerful, as Ed Miliband would say. One, voter sentiment towards climate action is here to stay. We've had the first climate election in Australia where we've seen pro-climate Labour MPs voted in coal mining areas. I think this is an important signal for future elections to come. And I can say this now that I'm no longer a civil servant. I would also contest, this is why Liz Truss U-turned, and we've seen a lot of U-turns, I think, in the last couple of hours, if we've been following the news. U-turn on ditching net zero 2050, despite flirting with it in the leadership contest. Because Boris realised, having worked closely with him, climate is going to define the elections of the future, for better or worse. Whether you're left or right, this will be the defining issue. If you look at the polling, over 3/4 of UK voters have said that they will be proud to be voting for a party that is pro-climate action, and that is despite the cost of living crisis we face currently. Also, energy security is now synonymous with decarbonisation. I also think that it's a good thing. We've seen ambitious national plans to transition to that clean energy future in the medium term. Take Europe, doubling down on renewable energy. Numbers are up for grabs, but 45% of their energy mix by 2030. India's revised its 2030 plan upwards and has got really ambitious plans on hydrogen and solar. And in the US, Joe Biden has passed the Inflation Reduction Act at around $369 billion. That's the largest domestic package for climate action in history. And the number and data is also showing, even if it's a bit mixed right now, slowly but surely the world is moving towards clean energy. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, show this year alone there'll be more than 1.2 trillion in clean energy investments. That is up 12% increase from 2020 and on an upward trajectory. But we also need to acknowledge, as we shift from a fossil fuel to a mineral-intensive economy, there are new geopolitical and dependency risks. We are likely to see a new battle, I would argue we already are seeing this, for sustainable energy between China, the US and Europe. It's forecast the top 10 countries for critical minerals needed for net zero, to build your wind turbines, your solar panels, your electric vehicles, will have a market share of around 75%. So it'll be vital more now than ever that we have a global transition to clean energy and unlock that capital to prevent a two-tier world between those who are energy and resource rich and those who are not. So to conclude, to paint a picture for the discussion, I started off with one simple question. Are we on track for climate catastrophe, or is this a catalytic moment? Perhaps the civil servant in me is hedging the bets and saying we're somewhere between the two. But I'm an optimist, and I believe with the right steps and collaboration, this crisis could become a catalytic moment. Yes, the transition will bring new geopolitical risks and uncertainties. It will require honest and difficult debate to find legitimate solutions that are equitable, inclusive and meaningful. But time is short and we can't afford to delay climate action. And we're going to need leadership from current and future generations, including the very best and brightest we've got in the room today. And being an optimist, I think it reminds me of the words Sir David Attenborough told me and our team at the beginning of COP26 in Glasgow, because each of the world really, really does depend on all of us. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jasper. We would now like to invite our panelists and our chairperson up to the stage to have a discussion. Thank you very much.
Where would you like to see?
excited spirits.
Apologies, Rita, we've got a mic for the live
I'm
stream.
sorry,
Yes.
I thought my husband, I shouted loudly.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, can you hear me all right now? No? Okay, done now? Now you have to go to the other side. Well, thank you very much. And Jazz, you've set this discussion off, brilliant with all the salient points. And we're particularly fortunate to have you because you are an insider, you have inside knowledge, and you helped to shape, the thinking and the strategy for COP in Glasgow. And it was very useful and helpful to know that what we can expect in Egypt and later on. And of course, funding seems to be a critical issue. Now, so I thank Wolfson and the Research and Sustainability Center here for drawing attention to what has become critical for us all. Because so far, or in earlier years, you felt things were happening outside, it didn't affect us. But now in this global world, we're all affected. And the picture is bleak, but as Jazz said, there are also a few positive points we can draw on. But what is even more important is now it's also in our hands, in each one of our hands, to do something. So you've seen what the note is, what the title of the theme is the climate emergency a failure of inclusion? And the three questions we've been asked to address, because we've got a very short time, and each speaker has been given 3 minutes to cover that. But having said that, you can cover the other points in the Q&As and later on. So the questions are, what roles have exploitation, inequality, and exclusion played in causing the climate emergency? What solutions of inclusion are there to increase climate action and progress? And what are the best ways academic institutions such as Wolfson can contribute to these solutions? So these are the answers we want, and then you will get a chance to ask the panelists questions as well. Now, before I invite the speakers to make their comments, I came across this Christian Aid petition, which I thought really summed up where we are now. And it says, crops ruined by drought, homes destroyed by hurricanes, roads washed away by floods, countless lives lost. This climate crisis is hitting vulnerable communities the hardest. Yet those who have done most to cause the damage, rich nations and fossil fuel giants, continue to ignore demands to provide loss and damage funding. We say it's time for polluters to pay up, to do their moral duty by our global neighbors. It's time government set up a central fund to help poorer countries repair and rebuild after climate disasters. And as a large emitter, it is also the UK's duty to push for this fund immediately. So that's the overall cover. Now, can I just ask each of you to introduce yourselves and also one or two salient points that you think would be of interest to the audience. And then I'll ask you to speak in this particular order. So would you like to start first? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Karen Alvarenga. I was a consultant for the United Nations, many agencies for more than 10 years. I worked for NGOs and the government, the Brazilian government, and now I work at the private sector. And I studied here, I did my PhD here on climate change and distributive justice in 2003.
Hi everyone, my name is Rhoda Owako Keyo, and I am a Wilson alumna. I'm a conservationist by background, and currently I work at the Cambridge Conservation Initiative as Associate Director of Fundraising. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Raquel Scarpa-Guevara. I am a PhD student here at Wolfson and at the Faculty of Education. My topic of research is I'm analyzing an education program offered to fisher women in the Amazonian coast. Thank you for having me tonight.
Welcome.
Hi everyone, my name is Majdi. I'm a doctor and a scientist based at the Sanger Institute, investigating the role of the gut microbiome in nutrition and infectious diseases. Thank you.
Excellent. So would you like to set us off? So I will be not too strict, but still we'll watch about 3 minutes on the main issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the first thing is exclusion and driving the climate emergency. So I'm sorry, but I need to go back to Kyoto Protocol. I know everyone loves the Paris Agreement of 2015, but it always started in the Kyoto Protocol in 1998, I think. And what happened there was lack of inclusion in a bigger level, because I remember I was part of the Brazilian government delegation at the time, and the Brazilians were crazy because they really wanted a historical emissions. They wanted the commitments from the developed countries to be based on historic emissions, which seems to be quite fair if you think that who polluted the most should commit the most to reduce. But this was a problem when the implementation of Kyoto came, because in 2001, George W. Bush decided to leave, and China didn't have commitments, and India didn't have commitments, Brazil didn't. So, and the Kyoto Protocol had many instruments. They had clean development mechanisms, and they achieved a little in carbon trading, but what happened is emissions didn't come down. It went up to 40% because of this lack of inclusion. And then if we talk about, and what I like about the Paris Agreement now is that all countries, they have commitments. I know it's sad that the historic emissions have been dropped. I really like the historic emissions because I think loss and damage are based in historic emissions. So you can see that I actually think the fund for loss and damage will not take us anywhere because of that. Kyoto didn't take us anywhere. So I think we need to forgive, and we need to unite and go from here. And on solutions, what I really, really like is the payment for environmental services, which are an offset agreement that you have, in which the governments, a national government or a state government or even private sectors or NGOs, they can set an agreement in which people that live near rivers, forests, they receive an amount of money for preserving the forest, and also there are many conditions that come along with the cash transfer. And it started in Costa Rica in '96, and then reproduced in Mexico, then came to Brazil, and we have, I really like the project we have there since 2007, which is called the Bolsa Floresta, which is the forest kind of funding for people that lives in the Amazon forest. And what is beautiful about it, in a way sad and beautiful at the same time, is that the state government pays around $30 per family. More than 7,000 families are covered to protect the forest, and they monitor with satellites as well. And they pay it to women. And is the female head of the family who receives it for many reasons. And it has been, it has been quite successful in a way. It has dropped down, and then now with the funding from the Norwegian government, it has been, it will increase, I think. And what is the last question? What Wolfson can do?
Yes, what are the best ways institutions such as Wolfson can contribute to these solutions?
I think Wolfson is contributing a lot with the hubs. I love the sustainability hubs, which has loads of amazing researchers there writing papers, and there are PhD students here or master's students doing climate issues. And what I like the most that Wolfson is doing is the garden. Because I went to visit the garden, because it's nature-based conservation. And I talked to is Mr. Oscar Holgate? Yes. So he told me he was going to transform the garden, and he included all the students. Anyone who wanted to plant could come and help. And I thought, what an example of nature-based and rewilding and using the space that you have for carbon capture and involving the students. So thank you.
Well, that's very constructive and gives us hope. So Rhoda, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so
You know the questions, or shall I?
I know the questions, yeah, thank you. So 3 minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, so just to revisit the keynote today, where you stated that countries with the least responsibility for the climate emergency are the ones that actually suffer the most. And I see one of the things that exemplifies exploitation in this case is through funding or the climate financing. In 2009 in Copenhagen, developing countries made a pledge, $100 billion per year going towards developing countries by 2020. And see, we're in 2022. There's a shortfall, a huge shortfall, and access is also an issue. So in this case, developing countries continue to struggle to access this funding. And if it comes, the countries that have already met their commitments, it comes in the forms of loans, high interest loans, almost always in US dollars, and we see the local currencies dwindling. So we find developing countries, they find themselves in this rut where they are not responsible for climate change, and yet they have to get these high interest loans, which they have to repay, and then which takes away from the public services like healthcare, education, infrastructure, and so forth. So to me, if this doesn't really bring to your mind some kind of exploitation, then I don't know what else. But to me, I think it's something that we just need to bear in mind as well. So in terms of solutions, I would say look at green financing policies with a different lens in terms of not just having a blanket climate change and adaptation policy, as is often the case, because different countries have different abilities to respond to the climate emergencies. It's not all the same one blanket policy applied. So if we could focus our efforts to try and resolve some of these issues from a policy angle and apply them tailor-specific to different countries or different economies, I think that would be of value. Institutions like Wolfson, what can they do? First of all, I'm a Wolfson alumna from Kenya. We need more capacity. I'm a conservationist. I practiced conservation in Kenya. Came here on a Commonwealth scholarship. We need more resources. We need more funding to the global south. We need to see more faces. I need to see more faces that look like mine in this room. The other thing, research. It's very critical. And data. Kenya just released its climate finance report. And one of the limitations it cites is access to data and also good quality data. So I think Wolfson stands a good chance as a center of research excellence to come up with data that's open access to help economies or countries to develop robust, credible, evidence-led policies. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Raquel?
Okay. I made some notes here, scribbled. It's like a mini budget. We know how that went. Okay, so I'm going to pick from the first question, I'm going to pick specifically the concept of exploitation and inclusion. And I think my first research career was in marine biology, and something I learned deeply from ecosystem studying is a system approach of analysis. And what you have is, climate is a complex system. And when we study complex systems, we see that when you poke a system, you have a shift, and then it goes back to its fluctuating equilibrium. And that's what we call resilience, is how much effort or time does it take for that system to come back. So what you have is, in terms of exploitation of natural resources, that was the ultimate poking of climate as a complex system. So we have reached a point, and many of my ecologist researchers, colleagues agree that tipping point has gone. We're not going back to the fluctuating equilibrium. We are going to face a new equilibrium, which we don't know yet where it is. So exploitation of natural resources, yes, it was the root cause of it. Why we did it, that's another conversation that I'm not sure I am qualified for that. The other aspect that I wanted to pick on for the first question is inclusion. So the question is phrased in a way like, if inclusion, I'm gonna go back to the question, because it's inequality, exploitation, inequality, and exclusion played a cause in the emergency, climate emergency. And I don't find it easy to connect inequality as a cause. I see that climate emergency and inequality are an outcome of exploitation. I see it more like this. I can see this connection a bit more clearly than seeing inequality as a root cause. I can see, however, that, and in my research I've seen this a lot, how inequality is aggravated by climate emergency. So the second question then, I hope I'm not, the second question was on solutions. And this brings me to my research, and I think I don't see it, maybe unfortunately, I don't see it as a solution. I see what we have in front of us are mitigation and maybe monitoring actions that we can take for this new system equilibrium that we're going to reach. So things such as financial inclusion of women in fishing communities in the Amazonian coast, which is what I'm interested in my analysis, in my research. This, to me, is an interesting way of dealing with the effects of climate breakdown. The last question is, what can institutions such as Wolfson do? And I think I totally agree. These conversations are great. So this is great that Wolfson is doing this, but it does come down to funding. Wolfson paid for me to go, or gave me the funds to go to my field work. Without the grant from Wolfson, I wouldn't have been able to go to the community, live in the Amazonian coast for a few months, live with those women and understand the reality, because I think there's a huge distance between what is discussed in meetings with policymakers and what actually happens in these communities. So the funding from Wolfson, for me to be there and live there and talk to them, that is crucial. So we do need more funding. So keep funding us, Wolfson.
Well, Raka, I'd like, and I think everyone else would like to know a little bit more about your experience of the Amazonian fishermen, or working with them, and how they saw the world outside. We can do that once we've heard from Majdi. So Majdi, what is your take on the situation? And you've got your Harvard Medical School, open biome, child health, enteric infections. So you've got this health view and things. Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, sure thing. So on the question of what role does exploitation and inequality potentially play in the climate crisis, I think maybe two stories, if I can share those very quickly. Yeah. I think the first comes from when I was working in Boston, in the US, and in the summer in Boston, the heat waves can get really high. You know, I think here we talk about sort of mid-30s. They're easily over 40s. People are experiencing those temperatures for a number of days. And I remember a patient who came in, an elderly gentleman in his 80s, who was found confused in his flat, which was on the top floor of a low-income housing building in one of the poorest parts of Boston called Roxbury. This is an African-American gentleman who lived on his own. His carer had to skip a day because she was overstretched and couldn't make her regular visits. He had an air conditioning system that wasn't working, and he couldn't even afford the electricity to maintain that air conditioning system, and had one window open in his apartment. The paramedics who found him said when they opened the door, they thought there'd been a fire because the heat wave just hit them so hard. And so I think, thinking about what role inequality plays in climate change, I think I completely agree that it isn't potentially just only a cause, but also exacerbates those who are exposed to the direct effects of it, increases their susceptibility and vulnerability as well, so that, swap out an 80-year-old gentleman at the top of this building for a mum with 2 kids who's working 3 jobs to make ends meet. The same story could play out again in terms of those voices that aren't being heard at the table when we come to climate change discussions. The second story, very quickly, is from another part of the world, Sudan, where we're originally from, my family. In the 60s, a dam was built on the Egyptian side of the Sudan-Egypt border that flooded the town that our family originally from, called Wadi Halfa. Been settled for thousands of years, very rich heritage. I think some of you may know about the archaeology around there with the pyramids and ancient Nubian and Egyptian sites. And this dam was built with no stakeholders from that community at the table. It was negotiated between the Khartoum government and the government in Cairo. And unfortunately, that dam created a lake that flooded this community who were displaced and relocated to a completely different part of Sudan that they had no familiarity with. In the middle of the desert, these houses that were built were nothing like the ones they were used to. They were exposed to malaria, which they hadn't been exposed to before, and so had become increasingly susceptible to malaria, unlike other parts of Sudan. They were living in close quarters with each other, so experiencing tuberculosis, unlike they had been experiencing before. And because of water scarcity, outbreaks of cholera were occurring as well. And we've seen this week in Nigeria the floods that have occurred, displacing 1.4 million people. And so, thinking about how are these communities going to be factored into some of these discussions that Jasper highlighted at the political level, I think is going to be so important when we start to see some of the health effects not only affect these communities, but potentially spread and cause impacts for other communities around the world. So that's, I think, on the sort of first question. I think on the second point, in terms of what solutions, I completely agree with all the comments that have been made. I think data, incredibly important. How are we designing the technology to address some of the consequences of climate change and also to prevent it as well, with keeping in mind the communities that aren't being represented at the table, and many of the communities that folks are working on here. And in terms of what can Wolfson do, again, completely agree with the panel that have the points that have already been raised. I think building partnerships with the international community and building equitable research partnerships is going to be so important. I think also not only thinking about this from a global perspective, but thinking about regional inequalities here in the UK. Our family from Sudan eventually settled in Grimsby, which is a coastal town by the Humber, known mostly for its fish and chips, but is actually just recently opened the largest offshore wind farm in the world. And this is a community that has a 13-year life expectancy gap compared to the rest of the UK. So if you're a man living in Grimsby, you're likely to live 13 years fewer compared to someone in Kensington or Chelsea. Now, when I talk to young people in Grimsby, none of them are involved in the offshore wind projects. None of them are seeing the potential gains and opportunities of climate change adaptation that are occurring just outside their front doors. And so I think we have to think really carefully about how we can engage, those communities as well here in the UK, so that we aren't having to say that it's a sort of scarcity of resources where we are supporting global partnerships but not supporting folks here in the UK. I think we have to do both. And so that's another challenge I would pose for Wolfson going forward as well. So I'll pause there. Way over 3 minutes. Sorry about that.
Thanks very much. As you say, it's ironic that although we are here, there are summits, international meetings, we're having meetings here about climate change. A lot of people who are affected, they don't have the means to take part, to get their voices heard. There was a woman from Indonesia I heard on Radio 4 about a week ago, and she was saying, yes, there's this meeting in Egypt. We don't have the funds, we don't have the money to attend these meetings. There are other people to attend, so they don't. The people that I would imagine, the Amazonian fisherwomen, they wouldn't know where to start if they were, they never get to any of these big summits. So there's inequality even in the world of environment, people who care about the environment and who want to do something about it. So I don't know whether you have any ideas of how this can be addressed. I know you've talked about funding. If there was unlimited funding, how do you think that would help to tackle the problem of inclusion or the issue of inclusion? Yes, since you talked about it. So should we go to Rhoda first, and then you can all have a go. That.
Okay, yeah, unlimited funding, that's every fundraiser's dream.
So what would you do with that?
Well, I think we'd solve climate change with unlimited funding. Like it's just my mind just thinking about having unlimited funding. There's so many things that we could get up to. But I think for me, it would be the equitable distribution of that unlimited funding, because we've seen many situations where more Western-centric applications, you know, I've been involved in projects in Kenya where we talk about trying to resolve issues or conservation issues, but then not necessarily taking the Afrocentric model of doing it. But then with the holder of the fund has so much power. So for me, it's a matter of how can we get the people affected to be involved in deciding where this funding will be applied best, will be of best use to achieve the greatest impact. Yeah.
And I think I would ask all the panelists that. So do you have any thoughts on that, Karen?
Yes, I think limited funds are dangerous because we're so much more ingenious when we don't have much fund. I think what we need is a limited amount of trust and a limited amount of participation in the local communities. I've just read, in preparation for here, the EPEBS, which is the Intergovernmental Policy Panel Policy and Science on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and was just published in August this year. And what they say, what is lacking is the trust and the participation of the communities and the integrating the views and the desires of the communities in designing the conservation projects, which will fight climate change. Because what happens if you don't integrate the community and their desires and their views and the diversity when designing the project, when designing the payment for environmental services or the cash transfer, what happens is they even boycott it. They can sabotage it. They go against the actions, as we've seen with the yellow vests, because it was a climate change issue of putting the taxes up in France, but that would cause so much trouble to all the poor people who live in the countryside and had to drive miles and miles to go to a doctor or to go to the school. So what I think is we could have limited funds if we cut all the subsidies to fossil fuels, and we did an amazing social protection work involving the local communities. That's what I would do.
Raquel, if when you were working with the Amazonian fisherwomen, etc., do you have any thoughts on how you could have helped them more if you had funding?
I think when I said the funding, I was thinking on funding for research and researchers and bringing more people from the global south, looking in the audience and seeing people like us. What I've learned, is I went through a huge journey of understanding occupational identity, which I didn't know much about. So I had to understand that what is it to be a fisherwoman, or a woman in a fishing community. And what does that mean? What does it mean when the natural resources that gives you this occupational identity is no longer? Who are you? And I think that what is missing is understanding this and bringing this understanding to the people that make decisions, because I think there's a huge disconnect. So for example, the project that we were talking, was spoken earlier about paying for the families to maintain that area. I met several of them, and it's really weird for them, because that can't be their job. That can't be how they're making their money. That's not who they are. That the environment is part of who they are, but they live their life in their community doing something. So I think understanding their identity a bit better and then bringing it to the people that can make the decision so that these projects are better designed, I think the funding for this understanding is needed. I was supposed to collect data in 20 communities. I went to 1 because I didn't have funding. Do you see? So this is what I think I meant, is that and the other interesting thing, sorry, I'm just going on. Is it okay that I go on? The other interesting thing that I've discovered is when I ask them, so what is it about, because it's a mangrove region. It's the largest mangrove, continuous mangrove in the world, okay? And they can't explain to you the ecosystem services that a mangrove does, which is amazing. They only repeat that this is our habitat, this is where we live, this is who we are. They don't understand all the complex chain reactions that will and are being triggered by that mangrove not being there. But this is part of it. So what I think is also even funding for Blue Sky's research in the tiny fixing of carbon in whatever bacteria or that happens there, and bringing this forward. I think this is something that to me became very alive, that we need research funding so that we can go there, understand, and bring it back and think for them, for the context, as you were saying. I think.
Majdi, what are your thoughts on the funding and the best way to use it and be more productive, constructive?
Yeah, I think what Raquel speaks to is sort of the scale of the problem, right? This is climate change intersects in so many different ways among so many different communities that are facing all of these questions today. And so coming at it from a sort of infectious diseases, public health perspective, I think one of the things, we've historically done in this field is take samples from places that we think are interesting, bring them back to places like Cambridge, Oxford, London, analyze them, report back, the data in a paper maybe a few months later, and then we sort of, kind of haven't really engaged or built capacity for the researchers in the communities where these samples have come from. And so I think we need to completely flip that approach in many ways. How can we develop the tools so that communities in whether it's Kenya or in Brazil are themselves doing the research that they need to hold their politicians to account? If it's the rising occurrence of zoonotic diseases or the increasing rates of AMR or antibiotic-resistant infections, that's something that people in those communities can hold their leaders to account to and say these are the consequences of climate change. And so that all of that advocacy isn't being centralized and managed by one community. It's actually decentralized and everyone can make their case to their leaders. So I think if, it would be great to have all the money in the world for all 4 of us here to do what we want. But, I think, in a world where that isn't the case, I think bringing down the cost of these tools for in our field, genomic sequencing, and being able to analyze that information and to have it in the hands of basically anyone, anywhere who wants to analyze anything that they want to look at. So that would be my sort of wish list, basically.
While we've been talking about the problems, there are many, many communities that are helping themselves. And I remember after one of the heads of government meetings, it was either Mauritius or Vanuatu, I can't remember which, they banned all plastic bags, anything of plastic. There was another small island. What they'd done is they'd used old mineral water bottles to make roads and bricks for building. So I think sometimes, and I think as you already mentioned, small communities do know or have found ways to deal with it. They don't need a top-down approach. They need encouragement and maybe learn from each other. So can any of you give any positive examples of what you've seen, which could be the way forward? Karen?
I do like the payment for environmental services. I know there are many problems with them. One of them, for instance, is the eligibility. So when you choose the areas, so you leave some areas off. So and the people who stayed off get really upset. And then how to design it in a way that the entire community would understand that why some, in Mexico, for example, they said the cloud forest would be covered and the tropical forest would be covered, but this other forest, which sometimes is just nearby, the neighbor, they are not going to get the $67 per month because they are just a little bit, like some meters away. So that's why I think the participation, they participated and drafting this is very important. And this was since in the Amazon, this payment for environmental services has been spreading. They have many problems, but I think it's really good to have them in place. And I am mesmerized about the identity. I've never thought about that because I look at the legal perspective and the economic perspective, and I think it's brilliant. But then when you talk about the identity, it's just such an interesting point to take. And another thing as well, as the Obama administration said, the climate change, is a threat multiplier. So if you think, for instance, when you are in the Amazon, I went there a few times on vacation. I never went on research. And they don't have a birth certificate. Then they don't have a bank account. So the amount of difficulties to actually get access to this cash transfer. So they need to build, and they did it. And this is for years that happens, for decades that happens in the Amazon. There is a boat, and the boat comes, and the boat marries everyone in the community in the same day, register all the birth certificates, and it's just like a party. There comes a judge. It's all the civil services, small city council in the boat, and the boat is stopping and registering these people, then they can actually legally exist. Yeah.
Thank you. One of the success stories that have come up, I would say maybe as a result of the pandemic, was that most researchers in Cambridge could not travel to the ground. And so they relied on the local researchers to do the work. And so for the first time, we're seeing researchers who are not in Cambridge, who are on the ground, listed as lead authors. So this already, I find itself, is a winner, and it's also a morale booster and also an inclusive way of approaching, just speaking to your point of getting the local people involved on the ground in research and in coming up with these solutions. So for me, I would say that that's one of the successful things that I feel we are now getting researchers from the global south leading as authors and carrying out research that's relevant and tailor-made to their specific environments. Yeah.
That's great. That's very, very encouraging, again, motivating. Raquel?
I think interesting that you mentioned the pandemic. That's something I also saw in the community I was living with. So the financial exclusion aspect of people not having, in the Amazonian coast, not having bank accounts, this changed immensely with the pandemic because everyone needed access to the government funds to be able to survive. So that meant that everyone in the community that didn't used to have a bank account now have a bank account because of the pandemic. So to be able to have access to that monthly, and this was something also that I understood had a second effect in terms of what did that bring them? Why was this a success story that they suddenly had this possibility? It brought them together in terms of planning. So what can we do together as a community during the pandemic in a sustainable way? For sustainable, I mean to sustain an income, to remove the economic vulnerability that we're in. So I think that pressure and the fact that people were then forced to open a bank account made a huge difference in how the community organized themselves in terms of selling their products in the local market. Like they do it as a community, all of the women together, which didn't exist before. It was scattered. So I think that this is an interesting success story that I can share with you guys that I witnessed.
Yeah, I would just echo sort of everything that's been said, and I think one of the, if there is a silver lining from the kind of the experience of the pandemic for the last few years is, the display of expertise and capacity that's already there in so many places, especially around genomic sequencing for infectious diseases, which can be applied to some of these consequences of climate change. Whether it's South Africa and the early detection of variants there, or the work going on in Nigeria with Aruko Okeke on antibiotic resistance there, and who works with many folks at Cambridge. I think we're starting to see now, the residual capacity that's going to be left to apply to some of these challenges. I think the other thing to sort of mention is, we are starting to see now more conversations around mental health, and how does mental health kind of tie to climate change? I think obviously one thing is the consequences. We've talked about the impact on identity for many communities that are facing these challenges, and obviously being displaced as well. But maybe to bring it closer to home as well, I think I was talking to a friend who is very deep in climate change research and describes it at times feeling a bit like the person in the movie who can see the asteroid coming and no one believes them that the asteroid is coming. And so I think the mental health of researchers and academics and students, I think, is something that at least we're starting to kind of talk a bit more about now, especially those who are at the forefront of this climate change crisis and researching that, because it's only going to get, unfortunately, more contentious, I think, as Jasbir alluded to, the politics of this. And these scientists, this community that we have here at Wolfson and in Cambridge are going to be part of the folks who are going to be dealing with a lot of fake news and dealing with a lot of the heat from the conversations around what are the policy priorities going forward. So I think now, a positive thing that we're talking more about mental health and thinking about that in the context of academia as well, I think is a good thing.
When we're talking about inequality, maybe we should now look at what women can specifically do and how they can be helped. And what's prompted me to think about this is that when I was in Brazil many, many years ago, there were women who were cultivating spirulina and other algae to make protein. And also they were giving examples of how one woman in a village had a goat. She made money from that, sold it, those goats had other goats, and then other women, and the women became quite independent. In Bangladesh, many years ago, women got mobile phones, and they started taking charge of the farming and ordering. They got independence, and that also brought about a change. So can you think of any specific ways that women can be helped? Start with you.
I really like the green finance, as you mentioned, because they can do nowadays that there is the climate finance that they do microfinance, and many of the times it's for women because it seems they are more reliable in some points. And I think it would be nice as well to include the young together with the women, because we always talk about women, and I think the youngsters, they when they are in these communities, they are so lost and sometimes without hope for the future. So I think combining both of them, and also the men, because they are there and they can contribute as well. So I do like the climate finance and kind of things like Kiva. I know it's not for the environment, it's just for opening a business, but having a green Kiva in which we all could do a crowdfunding and finance small projects in the communities via this crowdfunding.
So when I think of women, I think of my mother in Western Kenya, and she's part of a women group where they try to meet and have this very strong camaraderie where they talk about issues, they try to, contribute the little they've got and pool and have like plant trees or just engage in different kinds of projects. And in that small scale, but then I would imagine if we harnessed this power of women coming together, collective camaraderie across the globe, imagine the power of that. What could come out of that, you know? So for me, it's just creating an enabling environment for women to thrive and to come up with these very, you know, exciting and innovative ideas to help address the climate emergency. Yeah.
Great. Okay,
I think what I can contribute, it's so hard making an analysis of a binary women and men. I'm not sure I agree with that perspective. Even looking in traditional communities where we're learning more and more that this binary doesn't exist. However, one thing I learned this year, analyzing my data and observing, is that there is two big chunks that we can say it is more common in women and less common in men. It's how the long-term and short-term solutions. So this was something I was interested in. Why is it that this NGO that implemented this financial literacy education program that I was researching, why are they targeting women? And one of the reasons given is because women have a long-term view, and whereas men, they think of solving the problem immediately. And I just did some research about this, and it was interesting to find out that and talking to the women in the communities, this is something that comes out naturally. It's the tendency, perhaps because in these communities, women are the one that are taking care of children, women are the one that are taking care of the house, women are the one that are taking care of feeding, cleaning, providing for long term. So this inevitably becomes, in my community, I have to think not of this week, I have to think of the next 10 years, because I've just had a baby, so I have to think for the next 10 years. So I think this is something that may add to this discussion. Why women, and why would it be an interesting approach to include? It's perhaps this perspective of each group has a different thing to offer. Women apparently have this important long-term perspective to offer, and that's what I can contribute.
Marjorie, you've been outnumbered, I'm afraid, by women on this panel. But very briefly, have you anything to add?
I mean, I think men alone are not going to solve this in any way. I think we have shown consistently through history that solving complex problems are not something that especially male-dominated political elites are good at. So I think, I'm very grateful for the balance in this panel. I think thinking from the health lens again, when we think sort of what does a health system look like that addresses the consequences of climate change, this isn't going to be solved by tertiary care, by hospitals, by where we typically throw a lot of money in our health systems. This is going to be solved at the community health worker level, about thinking new ways of ensuring good nutrition for kids, thinking about vaccinations and immunizations, thinking about how we care for our elderly. And so many of the world's community health worker programs are built on the shoulders of women and leaders in the communities rather than men, frankly. And so I think we have to, acknowledge that. And if we are going to be talking about inclusion and actually building solutions from the ground up, I think we have to start, certainly in health, conversations with those community health workers and bring those women leaders in right at the start. So, yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So now we've looked at women, we've looked at men, the community, and what about the young people in the audience? So it's your turn now, so please do ask you any questions. Not just the young people, but the young people and anybody else who wants to make a contribution. So if you want to ask a question, could you raise your hands, say your name, and if you want to direct a question to anybody in particular, say so. Okay, hi. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Evening, everyone. Thank you for great start, but I'd like to offer a solution and a problem, and unfortunately it's in that sequence. Right. So my name is Steve Evans, I'm one of the members of the college here, and I study sustainability in industry, and one of the greatest frustrations for me, every year, taxpayers around the world give $500 billion to oil and gas through either discounts, tax breaks. If we could give $500 billion to the fund, we'd solve the problem. That's the solution. And it seems to me that there's a question of inclusion. Do those taxpayers know they're doing that? And can somebody please help me? An inclusive solution that says that taxpayers have to vote to give their money to oil and gas companies.
Jazz, it seems to me that maybe it's wandering your way, this topic, with your experience. So would you like to comment? You could come and stand here if you wanted again.
No, sorry. I mean, I'm tended to agree with you, having now no longer being a civil servant and being a bit more free-minded. I mean, it's very complicated. I think breaking it down, so Antonio Guterres at the UN has been really vocal on this, and I agree with him. We tried through the COP process to have an agreement at the G20 and G7 level on this, and it's had mixed success. But the real honesty is, I think parties should put it on the ballot paper, and if voters vote for it, then change will come. I think it's not as simple as that. But from a sort of political perspective, it is. And I think the world is moving that way, and the oil and gas majors know it. And I think they're prepared for it. The future, if you look at the data in the 2070s, sort of the age of fossil fuel is coming to it is reaching a tipping point. So I think it answers your question. Parties need to put it on the ballot paper and voters need to vote.
Anyone want to say anything on this? Or do you want to pass and go to the next question? Or do you have anyone saying? No. Any other questions? Okay. So someone here and then back.
Actually, mine was just in response to your answer. When you say about getting a question on the ballot paper or the parties to put it on the ballot paper and voters to vote, there's a lot of issues there with getting the party to put that on the ballot paper, and we also know that promises made at election are often not held, and voters voting, it also, again, like Steve said, about awareness about what people's taxes are going to, and there are barriers to that awareness being raised because certain people with a lot of power and a lot of money will, like the oil and gas industries, that will not necessarily be in their interest for people to vote against it. So how would you suggest to get around those issues? Or anyone?
I think, in short, civil society pressure is really important. And civil society pressure on politicians to act, hold them to account, is an important part of a democratic process to get change. So you're absolutely right. Having a pledge on a ballot paper isn't a necessarily surefire way you're going to get action, but the best way to get the right political signals is to keep up political pressure, and I think that's the role of civil society to do that.
There's someone who raised their hand at the back. Yes, would you like to?
Thank you. Thank you for a very good and important topic for the sustainability and global hubs. My name is Mohammed. I am an MPhil student in population health sciences from Nigeria. Throughout this conversation, there's one word that has been re-echoed over and over again, which is inequality. I'm not sure I like the word in this setting. I would rather hear inequity, and I'll tell you why. So the thing with global warming or climate change is that we all know that it's not really a modern day thing. History has shown that the world has been warming up and cooling down. But what we know about this is that it is a man-made catastrophe from the 80s, at least. But what has the local communities, the foot soldiers, the ones heading in a collision course with the effects of climate change been doing in history? Haven't they been having homegrown initiatives for climate issues? Unlike our keynote speaker, who's optimistic about the outcomes of the COP events, I wouldn't say I am not optimistic, but I would be realistic. I don't see a situation where the effects of the climate change, as we have all agreed, is being exported from the G20s and the developed countries to the developing countries in the global south. Then we shouldn't expect, when we use the word inequality, what happens is that each side should accept a certain level of blame and contribute a certain level to curtailing this effect. Then in that case, then we shouldn't expect resources to come just as the effect is being exported from the developed world to the developing world. We shouldn't expect resources and technical expertise, I would recall this, to come from the developed countries to developing countries. So if we use the word inequity, then COP events should actually focus on what indigenous communities have been doing and how could they be brought up there and discussed in a fair way that would allow, if the developed countries is cutting down emissions, cutting down green gas emissions and whatnot, what are the developing countries doing and in the global south to actually help them in a more sustainable way and a technical way that would be developed, rather than to develop protocols from COP20 and strategies and whatnot and then send it down to the global south to implement. That's where the issue of trust, I think, which has come up during the discussion, comes. You export, the developing countries exports the problems and exports the solutions. Is that how it works? It's not a direct because it's just a comment, and if someone wants, is happy to respond. Thank you.
Okay, I mean, I think that's a fair comment. I mean, I think others would agree as well. Your thinking shouldn't be sort of top-down, one-way solutions. Is that basically what you're saying? From where? Yes, any other? Shall we make this the final set of comments? Just also, while you sum up, also if, say, you want to send a message to Jazz to present to COP27, you can include that as well.
Yes, but I really love your intervention. And there are, in the convention, on the Climate Change Convention of 1992, there is an entire article about transfer technology and enabling environments for transfer technology. And there are enormous amount of ad hoc groups, working groups, and friends of the chair groups talk about transfer technology, both north to south and south to south, with like India and Brazil instead of like Germany and Nepal. So, and it's so difficult to happen because, just to give you an example, the US, for instance, all the research they do, it's all patented, and most of it is financed by the government. And when they sign the contract, they say they cannot give it for free. So just to give like a little overview of why we cannot transfer the technology. And there are papers on enabling environments for transfer technology. And yes, for sure, the transfer technology would be such a great help for everyone. But there are so many legal, financial, and institutional barriers that in the COPs they are trying to communicate and resolve, but it's really hard.
Okay, could you very briefly round up?
Yes, just very quickly. The top-down approach that you mentioned, for me, I'm thinking about whether we should be challenging things like the GDP that don't take account of natural capital. I mean, if we factored in natural capital into GDPs, then Kenya would be like leading, you know? We would be developed, you know? So it's just a matter of also developing countries or like developing economies coming together and pushing for things like natural capital and challenging some of these ideologies that are more, you know, more exclusive rather than, involving, I don't even know what to say anymore. I just hope that we can have natural capital factored into the GDP. Thank you.
Yeah.
I like that. I think my concluding comment is, and I'm not really very qualified for what I'm about to say, but I think that, and it goes back to Steve's question or point, or I think that there is a huge contradiction on the economic systems available to us. In other words, the capitalism does not work if it's about accumulating capital for profit. It does not work with what we're trying to talk about here. I think we have to come up with a new system, a new economic framework, a new way of dealing with this, because it doesn't, we're saying things that doesn't work in the economic system that is prevailing in the world right now. So I think that that's what I'm going to leave with. And if we don't solve contradictions, there's no way that we're going to solve anything. So that there is an inherent contradiction on how the developed countries have their economic frameworks and what they're saying when they meet for COPs. So you have to take that to them.
Okay, Majid.
Yeah, Jazz, my request, I would say that health is, we saw with the pandemic, the world got its act together in so many ways. There were obviously flaws in our response, but we saw the world come together and develop a vaccine in a couple of years and deploy that to billions of people. And I think, when I think back to that chap in Boston who was, suffered from heat stroke, how do we make climate change tangible and real for people so that they get their politicians to act more quickly? Having heat stroke stuck in your boiling hot room, we all know what that feels like now after this summer. We all know what living through a pandemic feels like. And so I think the more that we can leave and empower communities to detect the public health impacts of climate change, the more we're going to make it salient and real for people so that action starts to be taken. So invest more in health if we can. That's my ask.
Well, thanks to Wolfson. If Wolfson thinking of how it can contribute, well, you've provided this expert panel of speakers where you've covered so much ground with all your knowledge and experience. So thank you very, very much. And thank you very much to Wolfson College for making this possible. And I think there are enough points to follow up on. And I'd like to invite Charlie now to round up.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you for an excellent, thought-provoking and very stimulating discussion. I think the fact that we are able to have a discussion like this at Cambridge College shows how far we have come on as a society to be able to actually address these topics. So this event has been part of the Climate Change Festival 2022. If you want to rewatch what we have talked about here, this event has been live streamed on the college's YouTube, so you can find that at any time. If you want to hear more. If you do want to hear more on this topic, there is a Shade in Cambridge podcast which has been produced by students here, Anna, Megan, who's in the audience, and Raquel, who's on stage. A new episode is out tomorrow which talks about why climate justice is racial justice. You can find that online, typing in Shade in Cambridge into Google. Other search engines are available. There's also a talk on Monday that we have about how do you forecast organism adaptability to future climates that you can find online. If anyone here is doing research at Wolfson, there is a sustainability thinking space led by one of our fellows that's happening on Wednesdays, 4 to 5 o'clock, though we might change the time slightly, but it's happening on Wednesdays. If you want to figure out what research, your research means for sustainability, equally if you're interested in personal development for your own thinking, it's on Wednesdays as well, and we alternate between the two. Look out online. We also, my last little bit, is that we also have a book which, Steve, if you could hold up, is a new book out at Wolfson called Wolfson Kill or Cure. It's an art exhibition. That book is launching today. You can check out the exhibition in the combination room and buy a book if you're interested. And it talks all about sustainability from an art perspective. I've got very nasty notes because sustainable paper. So with all that said, I just want to say, to really close off, it is clear that all of this is down to us as a species, as a global species, to get us out of it. No one else is going to help. We have to do that, as we have touched upon in the panel, in a fair, just and equitable means. The way that we need to do that, I think we've touched upon throughout this event, is through inclusion, integrity, some honesty, and a huge dollop of self-reflection for everybody. To do that, we need community, we need access to knowledge, as you've all talked about, and we need a willingness for action, not just words. So I would encourage everyone tonight to think about what everything has been discussed and think about what you might be able to do about it in your sphere of influence, because here at Wolfson, we are trying to do the same. So thank you all very much. I'd like to see it at Formal Hall or in the bar after Formal Hall for those who aren't available. Thank you all for coming.